Welcome to Helping Organisations Thrive. Today I have the pleasure of Barry Hayes on the show. Good morning to you, Barry.
Morning. Thank you very much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
No, it's good to have you. And today we're going to be talking about and exploring your rows across the Pacific and Indian Oceans and see what lessons you've learnt from that, which I'm sure you've learnt loads from that. And before we sort of get into that, Ria, I just want to just for me really, and I always like to try and understand this from people. What's the why behind this? Why did you set out to row Pacific was your first one, and then ultimately why did you get into the Indian Ocean? I mean, it's just they're big things. I know it's become very more popular now, but it's still a big thing. And I just want to just dive into the why behind it, really.
Absolutely, I think the why is key, and I think it's sometimes it's not clear for everybody, and I think some people have a carrot and some people have a stick. But as far as the why is concerned, I don't really know how far to go back. But I think that the sort of key. I think if you're going to take on something as extreme as rowing an ocean, certainly in my world, perhaps in some people's world it's not extreme, but in my world that was a very extreme thing. I was working minimum wage in a post room for the Bank of America, so this was a very extreme thing for me to go and do. And the sort of, so I think people often require or have a trigger moment. For me, I think it was very much so my dad got very ill. He was in hospital and he was in a coma, and so sorry to start off on a dark note, but he was in a coma, and we got told he may not make it through this, and there was this leaflet about coping with loss, and I remember just sitting there in this sort of hospital bed with dad thinking, okay, so he's going to die, and he's only very young. He's only 60, which is no age. But what an incredible life this man has had. He'd been in the military. He'd done so from before I was born until as an adult. He'd always sort of gone away to sea for 9-month blocks, come home for 3-month blocks, and he'd done that for my whole life. Like say from before I was born until I was an adult. And whenever he'd come home, he'd have these incredible stories about the jungles of Belize and the deserts of Iraq and the penguins of Antarctica, and all these incredible, and the darker stuff, the drug smugglers he'd been fighting and the wars he'd been involved with. His ship was blown up in the Falklands War whilst he was on it. But all of these stories I found absolutely fascinating, and I used to tell all my friends at school about them. I still do. I'm doing it right now. But I remember thinking, okay, he's going to die, but he's had this incredible life. What an amazing legacy he's got. He's got 3 kids who are incredibly proud of what he's done. And then I thought, if I die tomorrow, what is my legacy? What is my story? What stories does Jack, he's 19 now, but at the time 7-year-old, tell his friends at school about me? It's not about my job. I worked in the post room. And I totally understand that children are proud of their parents for a myriad of different things. But for me personally, in my mind, I could not possibly see how somebody could be as proud of me as I was of my own dad doing those cool things. And that was really the trigger moment. I didn't know I wanted to row across an ocean because I didn't know that was possible. For me, I'd spent most of my life wanting to be in the military. Most of my family are in the military. I was in the Army Cadets for 6 years. I could strip and rebuild a machine gun by the time I was 13 years old. That was the route that I was going down. And then when I got to that doorstep, I realized that that is not an opportunity that is available to me. Quite simply, I've got asthma, I've got epilepsy, those are long-term health conditions, there isn't a cure, and you cannot join the military with those 2 things. So, and I'd always been brought up like, you can be whoever you want to be, and I think that's a wonderful thing to teach children. But I remember thinking, I can't be whoever I want to be. I've tried so flaming hard to do it, but I can't be. It doesn't matter how far I can run or how fast I can run there or how much I can lift in the gym. I will never be able to join the military whilst I've got those 2 things on my record. And so
was that quite frustrating at the time?
It was incredibly frustrating. And I was sort of very adventurous, through my dad, really. I'd climb, he took me up Snowdon when I was 5, and we used to go off camping. And I without my family, I went off to Africa and climbed Kilimanjaro when I was 15 or 16. I was really into sort of adventure and making it happen myself. But this suddenly just sent me a curveball, and I completely lost not off the rails in a horrendous way, but just completely lost track of life and just went down the path most followed, got a job, working in the post room. And that really frustrated me. But actually this trigger moment, those sort of big things make you start thinking about your whys in real granular detail. I remember thinking, well, why did I want to join the military? It's not for the uniform. It's not to be screamed at by a drill sergeant at 4 a.m. in the morning. It was for the adventures. And I realized I can still have those adventures. I've just got to go about it in a very different way. And the way that I decided to go about it was by taking bigger risks, both personally and financially, and by overcoming those hurdles that were in my way. And the hurdles were just normal hurdles. There were small hurdles, there were huge hurdles, but the big hurdles were things like family and career and mortgage. And those are they're huge, and they stop so many people doing so many things, but they are common to most people. And what I found was that once I'd made that decision that I was going to have this big adventure that I didn't know what it was going to be yet, but I wanted to change my life, have these big adventures, suddenly opportunities that were always there just became clearer at the being there. They were whizzing past at a great rate of knots, and those hurdles started falling down around me. So when I actually approached my family about rowing across, well, I didn't know rowing across an ocean at the time, but when I eventually decided to row across an ocean, when I approached them about it, they were absolutely fine with it. When I looked at my mortgage, I was like, well, okay, it's £500 a month, 3 months out, that's £1,500. That's an awful lot of money, but it's not, we can find that money through a loan or, some sort of credit card, or there is a way around that. And things like career, when I told my boss, he was very excited about it. He couldn't give me, the time off. He was like, no, I can't allow you to spend 3 months splashing about in the sea. And so I was looking at the reasons why again. And, so I ultimately spoke to the CEO of the company, not going above my boss's head because he'd said no, with his sort of, I talked to him about it just to try and sort of kind of coach the business into the idea that this would be a really beneficial thing for someone that works for your company to go and do something like this. You've then got an asset. I can then do talks for the company in all these different sales meetings. And they were really excited about it. And then they sort of cascaded it down. They didn't just tell my boss, you must do that, but they said, if you can sort of manage this, then it'd be great. And then of course, then my boss was fine with it. And I was able, so it was, they were because this trigger moment happened, suddenly everything became, I looked at everything in more granular detail and found reasons why, or reasons around, or,
Well, that's a shift, isn't it? I mean, you've got that why, that adventure and wanting to leave a legacy, but it created a mindset, by the sounds of it, that you thinking that everything is figure outable, everything is possible. Working out the mortgage, and it's not just the 3 months, because it's the many months or year or so beforehand in preparation, the training and gathering funding and everything else. So what was a shift that created that different mindset, that when actually, yes, I've got all these things, all the problems or the challenges, that made them see them more as opportunities or ways to overcome that?
Yeah, I think as I say, that trigger moment made a big difference to me. I sort of knew that I could do cool things. I mentioned before, I climbed Kilimanjaro when I was 15, and it took 2 years to get to Africa. And just climbed Kilimanjaro. I spent quite a long time in Africa, but it took 2 years to get to that, to get the money to go and do that. As a 14-year-old, I walked the length of Wales, and I would shovel horse manure in people's fields, get them to pay me to take it away, and then I'd sell the horse manure to gardeners to make that money. So I was making money for taking it away and making money for getting rid of it, sort of thing. So I sort of saved this money over years and went out and did that. So I sort of had this, I'd had this really good experience where I could, if I thought outside the box and I worked really hard, I could get something brilliant out of it. I think all that was kind of wiped with the whole military thing, which, upon reflection, I'm now 42 years old. I'm very glad that I didn't join the military, but that was what I wanted to do. And being told that you, under no circumstances, doesn't matter what you do, and I wasn't even looking, I wasn't trying to be an astronaut. It was a fallback job for many people joining the military, and I couldn't even get that. And it just made me feel very worthless as a person, as far as what I could give to society, what I could do for myself. And I just lost track. So I think I had that from a childhood, that mindset, and it was just kind of re-engaged when I looked at something. I'm a very determined person, and when I think I sort of got that determination back when I had that sort of trigger moment of them saying that my dad was going to die, basically. But I mean,
and why the Pacific Ocean, and why rowing? What was, I guess,
so I mean,
drive to get that.
Yeah, so I mean, and again, I'd never, before I got involved in the Pacific, I'd never been to sea before. I mean, I've been on a ferry to France a couple of times, but that was about the limits of my seafaring prowess. I never rowed a boat, even on the river. I didn't have any experience of doing anything like this. And as with most things, I was in the pub, staggering home at 1:30 in the morning. I think I've been celebrating the fact that it was a Tuesday, probably. And I was flicking through my phone on Facebook, and I saw this blog by a guy called Alistair Humphreys, who is a British adventurer. And he was talking about a guy called Philip Kavanagh in Dublin, who was wanting to put a team together to take on the world's first rowing race across the Pacific Ocean. And something just clicked inside of me. It was shortly after I decided I was going to have these big adventures, and it was just one of these opportunities that was always there. I probably would have read it regardless and gone, oh gosh, that sounds interesting, and carried on my day. But instead it was, right, I'm going to quicken my stagger home, get in and send this email off. Long story short, lots of emails, phone calls, Skype sessions. Finally, I flew to Dublin to meet with Philip. I think on pint number 7 in Temple Bar, we decided each other was quite sound, and we were gonna row an ocean together. So I mean, it was literally just an opportunity came up. There was no grand designs of rowing an ocean. It was, wow, that is something that I didn't even know was possible. I am looking for something like this. And actually, rowing across the Pacific became the catalyst for the rest of my life. It completely changed my life for the better. It defined my life, if I'm completely honest. And it was 10 years ago now.
It's interesting, isn't it? When you're ruled by, when you've got clarity on your purpose or your why, and you're governed by that, which is obviously great. You just go for things, and you don't procrastinate, you don't overthink things, and you just do it because it's linked to your purpose. And I think sometimes, people might look at you and go, well, that's a bit rash. You had a few beers, saw it on Facebook, and off you went. But actually, deep down, it was part of what you were seeking, what you were after, and pushing. And I think sometimes we just got to go for things sometimes and just step out and think, actually, because it's part of who I am, and it resonates. And sometimes it's always hard to explain to others how you got to that journey, but that's really important, actually. And just talk us through. You must have had, I mean, obviously, just getting to a start line of these is a challenge in itself. Before you even know, I've coached ocean rowers myself, and just getting to the start line is a real challenge in itself. What sort of one or two highlights of the challenges you faced, and how did you overcome those before you even got to the start line of the Pacific?
Yeah, so I mean, getting to the start line took a couple of years, or just under a couple of years of real hard work. But I think more than the hard work was the failure, and I think that's where the resilience piece comes in. And failure is so important to experience. It's not nice to experience, but coming back from those failures is important. So from our perspective, we kind of got a team together. Lots of people want to row an ocean until they realize the enormity of that challenge of getting to the start line, and realizing, oh, I'm not going to be able to work for 3 months, or actually the year before I'm only going to be able to do limited work because I've got so much else to do. So we got a team, and then we lost a team. Myself and Philip, we remained together for the whole thing. Then we got a boat, and then we realized that actually this boat wasn't suitable, and we lost that boat. Then we got another team together. And then about 6 weeks before we were due to start the race, 3 weeks before we were due to be in California, that team fell apart as well. We ended up meeting we basically decided we're going to push forwards regardless, and we put everything into this, regardless of, even if we're just waving people off at the start line, we were going to move forwards regardless. So we kept pushing forwards rather than giving up. And actually, we met crew member number 3. So we did it as a 4. We met crew member number 3 the night before we flew out to California. We met crew member number 4 in California, and we didn't get hold of a boat until 7 or 8 days before the start line. So, and this boat was old. It was, the electrics were gone, the water maker didn't work, it wasn't watertight. We were genuinely referred to as the Jamaican bobsled team of the race, but we put everything into that. And it seems like we just rocked up 7 days before with a boat. It was years of work, but lots of failure and learning from that failure to get to that start line. And that's
so. How did you? I mean, obviously, interesting, isn't it? Just before you're down to 2 of you, and then you got these almost last minute sort of entries into your boat, and almost then your boat at the end. It took sort of 7, 8 days before you got it. How did you deal with that uncertainty? Because people might be listening right now who have a lot of uncertainty. They might not be rowing an ocean, but they might be doing something quite big in their organization. They might be self-employed, or they might be just starting off on their own challenge of becoming a new career, whatever it may be. How did you deal with that uncertainty? Because it feels to me, as much as you'd invested a few years before, towards the end, there was massive amount of uncertainty going on. And how did you keep going with that without sort of thinking, oh, this is just not going to work, everything's sort of falling apart?
So I think that comes down to the amount that you've invested and what it means to you, and it gets to a point but if you're very, very comfortable in life, then it's very difficult then to make yourself uncomfortable. But obviously the outside of your comfort zone, bit of a cliche, but outside the comfort zone, that's where you learn everything. But if you're very comfortable, it's very easy to just go, okay, well, this isn't working, we can't do it, this is not sensible. But everything was on the line in my mind. Everything was on the line here. I'd got enormous loans to cover. We'd lost lots of money and we'd failed in the startup, and I got huge loans to try and cover my mortgage and payments when I was away, and everything was on the line to change my life, certainly, and probably the lives of the people that were doing it. And there was just so much invested in it, and there was so much on the line that actually giving up wasn't really okay. It was physically an option. It didn't feel like much of an option. And I honestly think that was one of the reasons why we did quite well in the crossing. There was 13 boats that started, and despite us being the Jamaican bobsled team, only 6 boats made it across without support, and we came second in that crossing. And I think that was there was quite a few people picked up by helicopter. There was a few people rescued by yacht. One person got towed to Mexico. But I think I remember thinking, this is horrendous during the first few days of this row. There's absolutely no way on earth that we were ever going to call in a rescue unless something catastrophic had happened, far worse than perhaps the next person. Because for us, we had no money between us. It was such a life-changing thing that they just didn't feel an option to just get home and forget about it, because it would have, I mean, even though we were successful in crossing the Pacific, it still took me nearly 10 years to pay back all the money that I'd borrowed and to overcome all the debt that we created by doing it. And to have had that on top of failure, of not rowing, was totally out of the question. Basically, it would have had to have been something really, really bad to have made us stop. So it's very easy to say, keep pushing forwards, and sometimes there will be failure in pushing forwards, but failure isn't the end point. Failure isn't the final point. Failure is the bit that says, right, well, this didn't work, let's try again, let's go and do it another way. And when we did the Indian Ocean a few years later, we were supposed to go in 2017, and we failed to make it to the start line, and it cost a huge amount of money. But it's not like I'm not a millionaire. I was earning minimum wage at the time when I started these things. So it's not money that I can throw away. But learning through failure has helped me enormously, and so that I don't make those failures in the future as much.
And looking back on, say, the Pacific Ocean, I know the Pacific Ocean is quite a tough one to go through anyway. So it's harder than the Atlantic crossing. Yeah. In your lessons of reflection of looking back of how you got to the start line, would you do anything differently?
Yes, and I think that's sort of every time you do something like this, you take away lessons about how you do something differently, and a lot of it is just knowing the climate, knowing the boats, knowing the people, knowing who to get involved with, who not to get involved with. Quite honestly, despite the fact that it sounds like there was this catastrophic episode to get to the start line, it worked really, really well for us, because despite the fact that I didn't know two of the rowers at all until we got there, that was actually a benefit. I think if you're going with your, like, I love my brothers. I've got two brothers. I love them. But I think if we rowed an ocean together, we'd probably end up with one missing by the time we made it to the other side. We'd fall apart, But not knowing the other two people meant that there was, there's bigger boundaries, and you're not crossing those boundaries as quickly and as easily. And there's lots to learn. When you're rowing an ocean, you're rowing for 12 hours a day, usually sort of say 2 hours on, 2 hours off, 24 hours a day. There's a lot of time where you're just either, to talk basically. And when you've got people that you don't know and you can learn something from them and you're talking, it's a really quite a helpful thing. And there were arguments, you can't sit in something that's about quite about the size of a large double bed, and you can't leave it for, well, that one was 45 days without some sort of conflict. But generally we were, in comparison to some of the people that took on that race, we were largely conflict free. And I think it was very much because of that we were still learning about each other as the crossing went on. I think the biggest thing that I would say to anybody that wanted to row an ocean or do something of that sort of ilk is to take on as much advice as possible. Certainly I found I read every book there was to read about ocean rowing. I watched every video. I found out all these key names kept coming up in the videos and books, and I sort of found out who all these people were, and I kind of made them my circle of friends, whether they wanted to be my circle of friends or not. And actually just immersing yourself in that world makes a huge difference, and makes a huge difference to what you can learn. And you don't have to be just talking to them about ocean rowing all the time. Just being in the pub with these kind of people, you suddenly start finding yourself thinking like an ocean rower and making decisions like an ocean rower, and that risk analyzing a little bit like an ocean rower. Before long, I knew more about ocean rowing than most people on the planet, and I hadn't even set foot in a boat. And I think that's true with anything, and not just ocean rowing. I can't speak Japanese. It's not going to stop me going to Japan. And when I'm there, I will start, if I immerse myself in the experts, I will start to pick up words, and I'll start to pick up phrases. And if I immerse myself and engage as much as possible for as long enough, I will become the expert in that language. I will become fluent, and you become the expert by immersing yourself in experts. And I think immersing yourself in that world is the best thing that you can do, and taking the advice. And sometimes that advice is expensive, hiring a coach or hiring, some sort of support or expert. But the shortcut that gives you is beyond comprehension. In some places, you could work for 4 or 5 years and not get to the place you are a few weeks on with a coach, basically. And I think that's enormously important for people to take seriously before they go in, because you can save, even though it might be, I don't know, however many £1,000 to work with this ocean rowing coach, you'll probably save that much money in all the failure you make on the way to the start line.
Yeah, no, I think it's important to get that external input and expertise around you. Certainly, if you're doing something really, whether it's ocean rowing or scaling your business, doesn't matter what it is, getting the expert, not only just creates that shortcuts, but also means you get a lot more expertise that will drive you forward and for longer as well, and sustain that. Yeah. Talk us through, I don't know, any particular challenge or perhaps not, almost near disaster potentially, either from the Pacific or the Indian Ocean row, and just explain that, what happened, what went wrong, that potentially possibly could have been fatal. I don't know if you experienced that sort of extreme, and how did you navigate that, and as a team, because obviously you had worked that through, and sort of what was going on in your head at the time.
So I think that, so firstly, the Indian Ocean was 4 years after the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean is orders of magnitude more difficult than the Pacific is. Any ocean can be the most horrendous ocean on its day. I don't know of anybody that's rowed the Indian Ocean that's gone, that was easy. Whereas the Atlantic can often be, quite nice conditions all the way across, but the Indian doesn't seem to do that. And it was, in my experience anyway, enormous. The seas were absolutely phenomenal to cross, and it really was a major challenge. And I think I probably underestimated how challenging it was going to be, and it was for me was the most difficult to do. And I think 99% of the challenges that we faced were mental challenges. I remember there was this point So the first 3 days of the Indian Ocean, we sort of shot out. We surpassed all expectations, and I think I declared myself a rowing god. And then, on day 3, realised, oh, actually, no. And this massive storm was trying to blow us back to Australia. And there was a point where we rowed, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You're constantly rowing every second of every day. And we rowed for 10 days. And at the end of that 10 days, constantly rowing all the way through the night, we were backwards from where we started. And that sort of the mental impact that had was just enormous, to be putting all of that work in for all that time, for over a week, to only end up being backwards, was so difficult to deal with. And then I remember 3 or 4 weeks into it, we had to have a conversation about, are we going to have to actually go back to Australia here, because we were making no progress whatsoever. And there was this one day where I'd had a bad day. The storm had hit, and the sort of deck had come up and smashed me in the face, and I'd nearly lost my eye through. I had a split eye and had all these bandages around my face. And we were having this conversation about whether we'd have to go back to Australia. And again, this was everything on the line. We put everything into this. I lost two of us lost our jobs in the process of doing this. I lost the contract I was working on because we were out there for so long, and everything was on the line. And I was in tears. I was in absolute tears. Like, what? This is the darkest point of my life. And then the very next day, we had these wonderful, huge whales came alongside, massive, great big creatures, far bigger than the boat. And they spent, an hour circling the boat and just gently nudging the boat. And then one of them just lay alongside the boat. And they've got this big whale eye, and you're kind of staring into this creature's soul. And suddenly that connection with nature, because you haven't gone SeaWorld, you haven't gone on a whale watching tour even. They were migrating, changed direction to come and see us, and we were the interesting thing to them. It was a totally organic connection with nature, and suddenly that totally changed our mindsets and totally changed everything. It filled us with energy, and suddenly we were going to make it across this ocean. And very much, what I found from ocean rowing was it forces you into these dark spots where you're learning. We have this, outside of your comfort zone is where you do all the learning, but we don't generally want to go outside the comfort zone because it's uncomfortable. We certainly don't want to go too far outside the comfort zone. Whereas with ocean rowing, you cannot get off. There's no way of getting off unless there's there's grave danger or grave and imminent danger to your life. So unless you're likely to die, then you can't just call in a rescue because you don't fancy it anymore. There is no option, and you're forced into these incredibly dark situations sometimes.
So how do you, having the no option piece, as in you can't just press a button and get off the ride, so to speak. How do you deal with that? Because that can almost feel like you're trapped. And how do you sort of navigate yourself out of that dark moments? And what did you do? Is there any sort of strategies that you did at the time or learned along the way?
You certainly you find yourself trying to compartmentalize things mentally, and you do certainly go to a very, very dark place, or certainly from my experience of it, you can go to a very, very dark place, and you're sort of trying to sort of compartmentalize all these sort of difficult thoughts. But there was, and this is, it sort of relates to I've always been very, very open, or certainly about mental health issues that I've had, serious mental health issues in later life, and how you deal with those. And it kind of was like that. You start finding these methods and tools to navigate that issue, that mental health condition, or that being stuck in a boat, not being able to go anywhere. I found that diarizing, I didn't take a diary to write, but I think on day 20, I just suddenly started writing every single day, and it gave me this focus. Listening to things like podcasts to sort of take my mind away from what the experience was, trying to sort of, and it's hard because you're so lucky to be out there. We live in this really busy world where there's noise, and there's phone calls and there's people at the door, and there's emails. you're so lucky to be out there, because there's nothing. You've just got this one focus. It's just to get to the other side, and all we've got to do is keep rowing each day. And you're so lucky to have that. We sort of have, there's a focus that, in current life about, mindfulness and meditation, and being present. And there's no better place to be entirely present out on the ocean with nothing around you, and you've just got that one focus. And that's important to enjoy. It's not all horrible. I sort of feel like I'm making it like it's this horrendous dark thing. I absolutely love ocean rowing. I love that experience, and I love what it gives to you. I love, and yes, it does take you to those dark places, but you have to know that the following day there might be this incredible experience, and it's trying to manage those highs and lows. But there are, coping mechanisms for when it's dark. And for me, things like music and things like podcasts and certainly writing, I found really, really cathartic. And I was reading through my diary the other day. I've not read it in 4 or 5 years, and it was fascinating what I was writing down. I've forgotten most of it, because a lot of the time, you may be hallucinating, or you're very ill, or you've sort of pushed that feeling quite down quite. There was a moment we were 8 days away from Mauritius, and we were in a horrendous storm. I was the only person on deck. We row in pairs, but one of the guys that we were rowing with had Parkinson's disease, and he was really struggling. And so he was my rowing partner at the time. So he was also in one of the cabins. So I was on my own. This huge storm came, enormous waves, and they were crashing down on the boat, and you'd feel them crushing your sort of head down onto your shoulders, and you'd come inside off a shift sometimes feeling like you've got sort of whiplash, car accident symptoms. And I was just getting to the stage where I thought, this is not handy, I need to come in. And then all the sort of stars disappeared as this big black wave came. You couldn't see it, but you just see all the stars and the moon disappear. It sort of sucks the boat up the face of this wave, and it spun us round, so we're upside down, and I'm sort of hanging outside the boat. I was attached by a cable, but hanging outside the boat, and sort of upside down, it then surfed down this wave, and our computers registered us doing 23.2 nautical miles, which is knots rather, which is extremely fast, particularly when you're upside down and not actually in the boat. And then we sort of self-righted, and I sort of fell out of this wave and back into the boat, and it was an incredibly intense experience, and I was sort of shaking like this. But then it immediately changed, because Billy opened the door, and he looked at me and said, are you all right? Everything okay? And I was like, yeah, fine. And then James opened the other cabin door, and he'd been eating chicken korma. So he had chicken korma all over his face. There was this big yellow streak of chicken korma all around the inside of the boat. And suddenly we all laughing our heads off about this hilarious thing. So you go from those sort of extremes of darkness and hilarity. And I think it's quite hard to manage those sometimes, but I think it is quite important to try and manage those highs and lows. If you let yourself get too manically happy about something, then those dark spots become even darker when they do come around.
And how did you? So now you've done 2 oceans, and I'm sure you've had some extremes, there's some dark places and some highs. Having whales swim alongside you, which sounds incredibly amazing, actually. When you get into those dark places now, what strategies or lessons have you learned how you deal with that? Because I'm sure life's not all a bed of roses now. Or has it changed the perspective on your life, or how you deal with things? Or has it made things, I don't know, your mindset very different than how it was before, how you deal with things?
Yeah, so I mean, it has done, and it's all well and good saying, well, we need to be more resilient, but there are barriers to resilience that we often, we should be more resilient, and we need to be able to do these things. But people have things like sort of long-term health conditions, and racism and homophobia and all those sort of things. They can be barriers to that, to resilience. But that idea of sort of pushing through isn't always particularly helpful, and it's something that I learned in later life. I appreciate this is probably not what you're sort of getting at, but from my perspective, after the ocean rose 2020, I was the point where I was suicidal. This was it. I was going to finish my life, and had to change. Very luckily, got in touch with a really, really good doctor and a mental health professional, who taught me a lot about what I can do. And I realized when he was teaching me about the methods of coping with what I was going through, they were very similar to rowing an ocean. It's about having these tools. And I think the resilience of getting through normal life is often more difficult than getting through an ocean row. Like I say, you've just got that one focus. focus in ocean rowing. You've just got to row. Whereas, dealing with relationships and dealing with a job that you perhaps is toxic is incredibly difficult, because when I ocean row, I mean, the Indian Ocean took 70 days. It felt like a long time, but 70 days is just 70 days. Whereas a toxic work environment, you think, when's it going to end? And that is a lot more difficult to deal with. And it took a little while for me to get around to understand that needed to be operated in a slightly different way. But actually, it was a matter of having those tools in your arsenal. So, I used things like I used a counselor, and I used prescription drugs at the time to help me with my mental health, and thankfully don't use those anymore. Things like seeing a doctor regularly, talking to people, creating a network of friends, and actually using that network of friends, not just having a list of friends on Facebook, actually talking to those people regularly, addressing chemical issues. I massive problems with alcohol, and have been sober for 906 days today. Not that I'm counting every day, but it's important to address those things, because actually, although I felt that was helping me cope with my issues, it obviously isn't, and we know it isn't. But actually coping with those and dealing with those issues head on. And again, it comes down to looking at things in a more granular detail. So what is it? Why is it that you are so struggling to deal with day-to-day life? But it is very much about having all of those tools in your arsenal. And I, in a good spot, I say I'm sober. I don't really have major issues, but I feel myself going downhill. And everybody has those downhill bits, regardless of whether it's labeled as a mental health condition. I feel myself going downhill, but having all those tools stops me then going into a really, really dark place. And just knowing you've got those tools is an enormous thing to help you with your resilience, getting through stuff. Just being able to know that, there is a counselor there if you need it, or you've got a support network of friends, or there's a good book that you can read, or there's something that you like to, or exercise, just enormous. We say this all the time, and it's just so easy to go, oh yes, exercise is great for you, but it's wonderful for things like resilience and keeping your mental health strong. Because the resilience is the best thing for resilience is having that strong head, and if you've got a really strong head that's clear and you understand what you're doing, then you can get through most things, can't you?
Interesting how you said that, doing the ocean row in some ways was, I didn't say easier, but because you're single focus, you're almost pulled out of normal day-to-day life.
Yeah.
And I appreciate there is challenges within it, and not many people will do that, and quite scary. And but actually, day-to-day life is tough in itself. And I think you're right there, saying we need to have strategies that personalizing. And the lessons I've learned, having interviewed on my podcast many people, whether they're extreme adventurers, Olympians, leaders in organizations, and talk about resilience, it's developing strategies to help you, whether that's creating a network, doing mindfulness. I do ice baths. There's all different things we all do that works for us. And I think it's knowing that we have to have strategies, because life is tough. And for me, resilience is not just about grit and determination, just getting on with things. Resilience for me is about learning and lessons before you get back up again. What can you do differently, and what support do you need? How do you overcome that? And that's so important for our mental health, and really acknowledging that life can be difficult, but actually we need help, and we need strategies to really overcome that. In terms of, obviously you've done all these great things, and now this you say your life was changed forever. Just want to expand upon that and what that means for you today, why this completely changed your life, these sort of two rows.
I think it's simply down to the fact that I think the biggest barrier for most people, and I see it, I see it in my family. I've got, my lad's 18, nearly 19, sort of, what am I going to do in life, and I had that issue where I just, I originally wanted to be in the military, couldn't do that, and just, what am I doing in life? I've got no focus. I've got no idea of where I want to go. Is the only reason I'm here just to tick the boxes, ensure that of course I want my family. I love my family, and I want them to be looked after. And of course I will do whatever it takes to do that. But is that all I'm here for? To just go to get this job that I don't love and make the money so that they can, that can't be it. But having that focus someone that knows what they want to do is that's such an enormous advantage, and so few people know exactly what they want to do. And it wasn't just sort of I did the row and suddenly I was like, click, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. I loved the ocean row. It changed. I felt it changed. I felt that I could do anything on the end of it, and then I suddenly got back into that adventure lifestyle, and I started doing, the ultra marathons and all sorts of stupid things. But that it sort of slowly sort of dawned on me that actually this was something that I loved. I could actually get a career in it. So I run a company called Sharkbait Socials, and I tell people stories. The problem with ocean rowing is that you've got your hands full with oars, and you're not doing selfies, and communications are poor, and you want to sort of tell the world about your project, perhaps not from a narcissistic point of view, but perhaps to raise money for charity, perhaps for your sponsors. And those stories weren't being told, or they certainly weren't being told in a passionate way, because people were hiring, say, a social media company, an ordinary social media company, and they're not able to tell those stories because they don't have the background knowledge. They can't, and often with people at sea, they don't get in touch with you for sometimes weeks on end, and you're supposed, as a social media company, you're supposed to be putting out all this stuff with no knowledge. So I sort of used my knowledge, and so I've been in ocean rowing for sort of 10 years plus, to be able to tell those stories, take what they could give me. Sometimes it's brilliant videos, sometimes it's sort of hallucinating, garbled voice notes, and sort of convert it into something that normal people can understand. And so I that's what I do. I tell people stories via social media on my company, and I realized that being able to do that is having that focus, having something to do, having something that I love, having a direction in which I go, which I love and I think helps people. Suddenly my life feels 1,000 times better. It overcomes huge amounts of certainly those mental health obstacles. The fact that you've got somewhere, you've got a direction, because I genuinely think that is half of the problem for so many people that I've talked to who have been dealing with mental health conditions, is that they're just a bit lost. And I think once you've got that focus, that changes your life completely. And it's been brilliant. The people I've, quite apart from the fact that my own head is feeling better, just the people that you meet once you start, your operational world is with people who are stupid enough to row across an ocean. They're of a different ilk sometimes, and you start meeting all these fascinating people who have, cycled around the world and crossed Antarctica, or want to go to space, or you end up in this different world. And it's, for me, certainly, as I say, life-changing.
Yeah, and I think that, I suppose, one of the biggest lessons I've learned from you today is this whole sense of purpose. Why? I know that, and that can be the whole, I guess, force of nature for you, and what it's done for you. Not only have you done the ocean row, but you then launched a whole business that is attached to adventure. And if you'd not done that, who knows what you'd be doing today? And I think it's those sort of moments when we need to step out of our comfort zone, push the boundaries a little bit, but led and driven by that sort of purpose, can really create a life that's really exciting and really linked and resonates to who you are. I really appreciate your openness today, Barry, and I thank you for sharing your thoughts and your lessons from your 2 ocean rows. If people want to connect with you and get in touch with you, what's the best way of doing that?
The best way is if you Google Sharkbait Socials. So when I used to go away to sea, my missus used to make me a playlist, and she used to say that I was Sharkbait, so it was called Sharkbait. Because so Sharkbait Socials. If you Google that, we're Sharkbait Socials on Instagram and Facebook and everything. So you'll find me on there, on my phone number and websites and all that. So it's it's all out there on Google. So yeah, Sharkbait Socials. And thank you very much for inviting me onto this podcast. It's been really good to have a chat.
Yeah, thank you for coming on.